Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide features the Live from NYPL logo in gold on a white background with the text, Live from NYPL presents 4 Lost Cities, Annalee Newitz with Amal, El-Mohtar, February 17, 2021, 8 p.m. EST. The second slide contains an image of the featured book jacket. The cover is divided into segments with 4 colorful images running horizontally across, with white spaces separating them. Each image is a depiction of an ancient city. The first one at the top shows a Roman temple structure with columns standing in front of a tall mountain. The second image shows distinctive Khmer temples among trees and foliage. The third image shows a group of low-lying buildings with flat roofs clustered tightly together. And the last shows a central pyramid-like building with steps leading up to different levels, surrounded by buildings with pitched roofs. The text of the book jacket reads, 4 Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, Annalee Newitz. Text on the slide says, 4 Lost Cities is available for purchase online from the library shop, nypl.org/shop. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card, available through Simply E on iOS and Android. Accessible formats are also available. Find out more at nypl.org/talkingbooks. The next slide shows recommended reading. There are images of 5 suggested books. This is How You Lose the Time War by Amal, El-Mohtar, and Max Gladstone. Archaeology from Space by Sarah Parcak. Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. And Toxic Communities by Dorcita E. Taylor. Text below reads, check out the full list and reserve these books by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live. The last slide features Live from NYPL upcoming events in black text on a white background. Thursday, February 18th at 1 p.m. EST. After the Insurrection, How to Build a More Resilient Democracy, co-presented by the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Thursday, February 18th at 8 p.m. EST. Racism's Hidden Costs, Heather McGee. Tuesday, February 23rd at 8 p.m. EST. The Harry Belafonte Black Liberation Speaker Series, Charles Blow with Hilton Owls, co-presented by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide features the Live from NYPL logo in gold on a white background with the text, Live from NYPL presents 4 Lost Cities.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is Aidan Flax Clark, and I'm part of the team that brings you Live from NYPL. So I am thrilled that you have all joined us. I'm here to introduce Annalee Newitz, of course, who's with us tonight to talk about their totally fascinating and entertaining new book, 4 Lost Cities. The book charts the historic rises and falls of 4 ancient cities in 4 distinct parts of the world at 4 distinct periods of time in the past, but manages to tell us quite a bit about urban life today in the process. Speaking with them about it is Hugo Award-winning author Amal El-Mohtar, whose most recent book is This Is How You Lose the Time War, which she co-authored with Max Gladstone and which won the Hugo Award. You can purchase Annalee's book, 4 Lost Cities, from the library shop, and I really encourage you to do it. It's just awesome. You can do that by going to on.nypl.org/shop-live. That's again, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds from your purchase go to benefit the library, and you can get a super cool library stamp for free when you check out. So I encourage you to do that too. Okay, I'm gonna invite Amal and Annalee on in just a second. A couple of quick housekeeping items before I do that. Real-time captions are available for tonight's program via stream text. You would have gotten that link in your reminder email, but we will also put it in the chats in Zoom and on YouTube. Annalee will be delighted to answer some of your questions at the end of tonight's program. You can send them at any time by sending them in the Q&A box in Zoom, the chat in YouTube, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. Lastly, we have tons and tons of great events coming up in the weeks and months ahead. And I encourage you to check all of them out at nypl.org/live. Just tomorrow, we have two. At 1 p.m., we're having a pretty important conversation about restoring democracy with Preet Bharara, Christine Todd Whitman, Michael Steele, and more. And then tomorrow night, Heather McGee will be with us to talk about her remarkable new book, The Sum of Us, which explores the hidden costs of racism on all Americans. Next week, Charles Blow is going to be with Hilton Alls to talk about his new book, The Devil You Know, and there's much, much more beyond that. So again, to see all of it, you can go to nypl.org/live, and you can also sign up for all of our events there. Okay, let's bring on Amal El-Mohtar and Annalee Newitz. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hello, Annalee.
Hello.
I'd like to see you on this last day of your virtual tour. This is
yes.
So gosh, I'm so happy to see you. I want to preface this this conversation with just how much I love and appreciate your work in general. I always feel like whenever I want to have a conversation with someone, I am torn between a desire to just go, well, let me tell you how much I love the thing, and then asking questions about the thing. I definitely have so many questions, but I just wanted to start by saying how timely this work feels. I mean, so For Lost Cities, this tremendous work of both scholarship and imaginative possibility is a mixture of things that I always feel deeply nourished by when I see it, like a combination of rigorous scholarship on the one hand, but that is not bogged down in the necessity of the detail of that research and can instead use it as a springboard for something bigger and stuff. So I find it so energizing to read this kind of book, and I'm just so happy to get the opportunity to chat with you about it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank
That's
you.
very kind of you to say.
Sorry. So I thought I would just start very basically with asking you about, like, how did this book come to be? What was the genesis of this project, which I think has taken you several years to bring together, right?
Yeah, so this is a book that I've been working on for about 7 years. And it started because I am a city person. I love cities. I have visited a lot of cities around the world as much as I can, when, obviously time and funds are limited, but I was very interested in thinking about human history in the context of cities, because cities are kind of monuments to public culture among humans. They are often monumental, often quite big, and they're concrete repositories of our dreams about what we can do as a collective. Not just as like a lone dude on a hilltop being like, "Rawr, I've got my box and you can't come in." Cities are designed to be for everyone, even when they sometimes fail to be. And so a big part of preparing to do this book meant visiting cities and kind of interviewing the city and figuring out whether, the city was a place that I felt like I could write about. In some cases, there were cities that I really long to write about, but it just wasn't possible for me to travel there. And so I started with this list of 12 cities because I was like, yeah, no problem. I can do 12 cities in a book. That, one per chapter, which was a foolish thing. And then as I learned more about ancient cities in particular, I also really wanted to be sure that I was capturing the diversity of urban traditions, because one of the things that you learn right away when you're talking to archaeologists about urban history is that, you know, there's a model that we're taught in school in the West, which is that civilization grew up in Mesopotamia and it produced these giant ziggurats and big, you know, brick cities, and that's how cities are. And that is an urban tradition, but that's only one urban tradition. And so each of the cities in this book come from a different urban tradition. They're spaced apart in time. They're very far apart in space. And so I wanted to have all of that in the book. And of course, there was, as I said, there were tons of things that got left out that, you know, I wish that I could have included, but I don't write epics. So I just kept it to this length.
That actually is like a huge question I had at the outset, was like, what were the physical constraints that made you choose these 4 cities? So can I ask what the other cities were? Like, what was your list of 12?
Oh man. Well, originally I had wanted to do Istanbul for sure, because that's such an interesting city. And of course, and also initially the 12 cities weren't abandoned cities. I had originally thought I would do a book about long-lived cities. Right. So I really wanted to do Beirut, which is an incredibly ancient city. And I wanted to do Xi'an, which has been actually 2 different cities over the course of its life. It's a very multicultural city. It was a Uyghur city. It's now a Han Chinese city, but it's still kind of a Uyghur city. And so I guess like what I'm really drawn to in a city is I love cities that have significant immigrant communities, which turns out to be every city.
Yes.
And this is actually one of the things that I learned in the course of working on this book, is that immigrants build cities, and that all the way back from the very earliest city that I cover in this book, which is one of the earliest cities in the world as far as we know, it's about 9,000 years old, it was full of immigrants. And so I love cities that have that where we can see in the archaeological record or the historical record the neighborhoods that these immigrant communities have left behind. So that's something I'm really drawn to, is when a city is kind of has honored its immigrant communities, instead of doing things like actually what was happening in Istanbul when I visited and I was doing work on it. They had just Erdogan had just decided it would be a great idea to just rip out the Syrian neighborhood in the middle of the city. And literally there were bulldozers like driving around in this area that had once been a lively ethnic neighborhood. So cities deal with their immigrants in different ways, obviously. And so one of the things that unites all these cities, though, is that we can in many ways reconstruct those communities. And so that's a thread that I definitely pulled on a lot.
I reacted the way that I did, saying like immigrants everywhere, because
yeah,
I recently had this really startling experience, which I'm trying to keep short because I really want to talk more about the book. But my family is from Lebanon, and like my family from Beirut specifically, but
awesome city.
It's so great. It's an amazing city. And I was thinking of Beirut actually a lot while I was reading about both Pompeii and Angkor Wat, in terms of like just because there was the blast in August, and thinking of these enormous cataclysmic events and stuff. But the thing about Lebanon in particular is that its diaspora is far vaster than the population of Lebanon itself. Like Lebanon's like maybe 3 million people or so, and the diaspora in Brazil is I think almost equal to that.
Interesting.
There's a specific relationship between the diaspora and Lebanon itself, which I don't want to take us off track by talking about, but in just my family history, I mean, I have grown up in a context of understanding that my parents immigrated because of a war, because of the civil war in Lebanon. They came to Canada in a certain context, and my life has been very much shaped by this idea of like people from Syria and Lebanon and the Levant being in other countries because of hardship and difficulty and stuff. And then I learned that I had known as part of our family history that like my father's grandfather, my great-grandfather, had emigrated from Lebanon, which was Syria at the time, to Brazil in like the late 19th century, and had married a woman in Brazil whose family was Swedish. And it turned out that there was a Swedish refugee population in Brazil because of the famines in Sweden at the time. And the idea that and I was learning this partly in the context of visiting Sweden for the first time, where there was a massive Syrian refugee population. And this like, this kind of give and take essentially of like someone that literally like the roots of my family could be from like Swedish refugees in Brazil who then lived in Syria and Lebanon, and that I should be witnessing Syrian refugees in Sweden closed this enormous circle. Anyway, it's a massive digression, but all to say immigrants everywhere, and our idea of immigrants is so contingent, I think, on so many other material conditions about how we organize cities and space.
No, it's really true. And I love that story because it is all about how you see these migrant populations moving from city to city. And because cities are places that welcome immigrants much more than other areas. And as I said before, of course, there's it's not always as welcoming, and it depends on what kind of immigrant you are. But I think that's a very I think your personal history is a common one in many ways, you know, and I think lots of us, especially folks in the States and in Canada who are from the settler generations, you know, we're from everywhere and we're all mutts.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's obviously like the settler colonial aspect and stuff like that is something that is so interesting to dig into, from like how orthogonal that is to ideas of immigration and stuff, and how, anyway, I don't want to get too much into
sidebar
for like 2 conversations from now. But right, so I love this though about so thinking about cities. I love what you, so sorry, how far did I wanted to know about the 12 cities that you had. So you had Istanbul, you had Xi'an, you had
I had Beirut, Damascus, a bunch of others. This was 7 years ago. Jeez, this is like a homework assignment. What were you thinking 7 years ago? I mean, what I was thinking was, this is too much.
Right.
And so the way that I chose these 4, as I said, I mean, part of it had to do with wanting to reflect different urban traditions. Part of it had to do with just where I thought I could travel and spend time. And so it really started because I had an opportunity to go to a conference of archaeologists at Çatalhöyük, which is the Neolithic city that opens the book. It's a 9,000-year-old city in central Turkey. So I'd actually gone to Istanbul and done some research, and then I hightailed it to Cappadocia to go to this conference. And it was amazing because there were all of these archaeologists like crammed into one room at the archaeological site. So we toured the site with all of these archaeologists arguing with each other about what it meant, and, you know, seeing it in person. And the thing about Çatalhöyük is that it's an enormous excavation. The excavation itself has been going on since the 1960s with some breaks, but the current excavation has been ongoing every year since the early 1990s. So they have uncovered like a whole neighborhood in the city, in multiple neighborhoods, in fact. And so it was kind of like a trial by fire, because I was listening to their debates over what the city meant. And I got really sucked in, and I was really intrigued ultimately by the idea of what does it mean when a city is abandoned? And when people talk about this idea of lost cities, because you can't actually lose a city. No matter how many, you know, awesome, you know, Aquaman type stories that you tell, there's just no such, cities are really big. It's extremely hard to lose one. And even Çatal, which is so ancient and had in fact been buried under layers of sand and earth, the people who lived in the area in the 1960s, when some British guys came and quote unquote discovered it, everybody knew it was there. Like farmers would, while plowing, would turn up figurines and pieces of potteries, and there were bits of the city still sticking up out of the top of the hill, and so nobody. It wasn't missing, it was just, what was missing was our ability to interpret it and to understand where it fits into global history. People living there in central Turkey knew how it fit into their own local history. And so each of these cities has a story like that, where the city is still around, people still know about it, but at a certain moment, adventurers or archaeologists or people from Western countries kind of discover it and bring the stories to us in the English-speaking world, and then the city becomes part of history that goes beyond its local region, and I love that. I love kind of thinking about how a city can continue, even though the city has been abandoned. Its story and the ideas that originated in that city live on. And it's a bit like the diaspora that you were talking about. The city that I closed the book with is Cahokia, which is an indigenous American city in southern Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis. And that's a city where people abandoned it in the 14th century. And a ton of different tribes and nations think of this as a city that's a kind of an origin city. And it kind of has this, it led to a massive diaspora of people who joined many, many other tribes and nations. And so it continues to have this life in people's histories, personal histories and political histories.
So I love that so much. And this a book that I felt like I had at the back of my head the whole time I was reading was actually your other book, Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, which I feel terrible. I actually have not read that book, partly because the title alone blew my mind in a way that I can't I just kept thinking as I was reading this, God, I really wish I'd read Scatter, Adapt, and Remember instead of just taking those three words as this kind of brain exploding moment of recognizing that. I think that was one of the first moments when I really felt the overlapping similarity of an apocalyptic event and immigration, essentially, that those two things entail the same action. Whether or not the emigration in question is provoked by a disaster, that is the same dynamic, that you have left a place, that you have to adapt to a new place, and you have to, in some ways, adapt your remembering to the new place as well. And I was thinking about it all throughout because of Pompeii, because of Angkor Wat, because of Cahokia, like in particular, the sense that that something grew here and something was lost here, but lost not in the sense of misplaced, but lost in the sense of grief, of mourning, of like no longer having access to. And I was just thinking throughout of just these things have entailed migration, but they are, but migration in and of itself is kind of that disaster in so many ways, like just on a personal, on a smaller scale level. But I love the idea that like there's also a hopeful way of thinking about that, of like the thing that is not lost, the thing that is actually, that endures, that is resilient and stuff. I also was really struck throughout this by this wonderful flexibility that you have between simultaneously making the ancient past intelligible to us with reference to hyper modern stuff, and also highlighting the many ways in which our knowledge of archaeology has been hampered by our own defaults. So on the one hand, like we need to, if you're going to do this kind of work, need to acknowledge and recognize the assumptions that you're bringing into it, but also need to use your familiarity with the world around you in order to imagine or bridge this enormous gap. And you do this so beautifully throughout. Like the thing I remember being so struck by when you talk about in the Pompeii section, Julia Felix having, so there's this woman who had these properties for rent, and just like has like a rent advertisement essentially that reads like something I could absolutely find on like the modern equivalent of Craigslist, because I don't know if Craigslist still exists or whatever.
That's part of archaeology now too.
Like I just wonder, I mean, how was that experience of writing these things? Like, so sometimes you take a character, like take a personage essentially, like Dido in Çatalhöyük and stuff, and where the archaeological record has identified this human who lived in this place, and it might help us to navigate this ancientness by imagining her and imagining her life as if she were a character in a novel, essentially. And I'm wondering, like, what was that process like for you in terms of translating all of this knowledge that you are gaining into something that requires these two extremes of like loosening your defaults and also loosing your imagination, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's something that archaeologists grapple with a lot too, because, I mean, there's a lot to say here, but I think when you are trying to reconstruct how people lived in a city like, say, Angkor or Pompeii, you do have to rely on some notion that you've developed from living in cities yourself, right? Or from living in communities yourself. And at the same time, you have to rein it in. Like if you see, for example, a for rent sign on Julia Felix's property, which is one of the many amazing signs that survived in Pompeii because the city was sort of flash burned, or it's not, I keep wanting to say flash frozen, but of course it was actually superheated, but it was preserved under ash. And so we have like political signs, graffiti, menus in restaurants, and this for rent sign. And it's very famous because Julia Felix's house was one of the very first things that was excavated at Pompeii several hundred years ago when people were first excavating. And she, it's tempting to say like, hey, it's just like now, like, you hang out a for rent sign, except for the fact that, there were only certain people who could own property in Pompeii. And if you're comparing it to, say, San Francisco, where, allegedly anyone is allowed to own property if they can afford it, in order for Julia to have gotten into a position to be a woman owning property, there's a lot of things that had to have happened to her. Like she had to have been married to a guy who died probably. Otherwise she would have been, under the care of her father, and he would have held any of her properties. So the other thing is that there were, every civilization that we study is constantly changing in the same way that our civilization is. And so when I was looking at Pompeii, because we do have a really good written history of Roman laws, I had to think about, okay, what were the laws at this moment in time? Because of course there'd been the Roman Republic, which had a whole different set of laws and assumptions. And this was the Roman Empire. So kind of after Rome became basically authoritarian, it was ruled by basically dictators, emperors, sounds fancier. And there had been, about a generation before Pompeii was buried in 79 CE, there'd been a big social shift where women were given more rights. Women who had a certain number of children were able to inherit if they became widowed, they could inherit their husband's property because they'd done this service to Rome by having these children. And freed slaves who made up the majority of the urban population were also able to gain more rights. They were able to hold some very contained public offices. When I say contained, there were certain public offices for freed slaves that they could have. and freed slaves were allowed to marry, and all of these things were new. So Rome was kind of going through this interesting social transformation at the time Pompeii was frozen. And so it allowed me to talk about what a social transformation looks like as it's happening. And a lot of these cities, one of the big revelations for me was the fact that each of these cities, when it was abandoned, of course, had a really long history. And Ian Hodder, who is the archaeologist who ran the Çatalhöyük dig for many years, calls this phenomenon history within history. And so what we're doing is we as people in the present are looking back at history, but as we do that, we're also looking at people who were looking back at their own history. And there's so many great examples at all of these sites, but especially actually at Çatalhöyük and Cahokia, where we see evidence that people in the cities were excavating their own past, that they were digging up things that were for them hundreds of years old and from their own ancestors, and treasuring them and bringing them back into circulation. So at Çatalhöyük, we know that people dug up the bones of ancestors. We know that there were certain ceremonies where it appears that people interacted with very, very ancient bones. Çatalhöyük, of course, was a going concern for over 1,000 years. So people living there were like, yeah, there's a lot of history here. But one of the things that I find so interesting at Cahokia is that toward the end of the city's habitation, people were digging up projectile points from the woodland tribes that had lived in the area before the city came. So, because when Cahokia first starts, when people first start erecting all of these massive mounds at Cahokia, there were like tribes living there. Small villages were there. So they settled on top of these villages. And then hundreds of years later, they were excavating these old, very different projectile points. It's very easy to identify them. They're clearly not modern for the people, at Cahokia. And they were treasuring them. They were taking them and looking at them the same way we look at projectile points from Cahokia and say, oh my gosh, this is such an incredible piece of history. So I love thinking about that in cities, how cities are kind of a repository for our public history, and how we integrate that history into our stories in the cities, in the present of the city, but then 1,000 years later, how people kind of look back at us and say, oh my gosh, what did that mean?
Something that I was also thinking about throughout this book was what you were saying earlier about the sense that like Western archaeologists arrive at the site and kind of discover it and stuff like that, and especially
it's a big thing that happens.
Right, a big thing that happens, and it's a very like it feels to me like, I mean, I'm sure it's been going on longer than the 20th century, but there's a particular kind of 20th century affect I feel that felt very recognizable to me. But throughout it, I kept wondering, like, what are the archaeological traditions of Cambodia? What are the archaeological what does the archaeological discipline look like there, absent Western gaze or Western intervention and stuff? And I was particularly interested about this in the context of in the context of Angkor Wat, because of the way that you talked about the translation of the Khmer, the ancient Khmer script, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, like, and it's again of particular interest because it brings up a couple of questions for me. Obviously, these are spaces that have like borne the brunt of imperial presence, particularly recently and particularly egregiously. But I also find myself thinking about how when I both when I lived in Beirut and when I was very young, but when I visited Damascus and I was in my early 20s, I was really surprised at what seemed to me lack of plaques on walls, like things telling me how old something is, which is something that I'd been living in the UK, where everything is covered, like there is, find me a space in London that isn't, 6 inches away from a plaque of some kind declaring a thing that happened or whatever. And the absence of this in Damascus in particular had struck me as like, well, do people just think of history differently here because they're living it? Because literally the old city has been continuously inhabited, is still inhabited, or that there are parts of there are like the cave city in Ma'lula and stuff in Syria where people are still living in these absolutely ancient spaces. And so I wondered, so on the one hand, I find myself wondering, like, I genuinely just don't know what the archaeological traditions are. On the other hand, are there as diverse, are the traditions of like thinking about the past or having relationships with the past as diverse as the ways that we urbanize ultimately? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I just super don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, some of this stuff is also outside my area of expertise, but I can say a few things. One, partly what I've already been telling you, which is that, of course, even in these ancient cities, they had traditions of history and traditions of remembering, and those traditions are linked to excavating objects. So this is something that Homo sapiens does, and people do it all over the world. And the same thing goes for city building. There was, I think, for a long time, a mistaken impression in the West that cities kind of arose in Mesopotamia and spread out from there. And that was just purely based on European self-regard and ignorance. Because, of course, there's an incredible tradition of city building in Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. There's an incredible tradition of city building in Australia and in South America. So we know that cities are it's convergent evolution. People are building them everywhere, but they're responding to different environmental conditions. So the cities have different structures, physical structures. Some, like tropical cities, tend to be what we would call garden cities. They're full of farms. They're usually made with perishable materials. Cities in the Northern Hemisphere tend to be built with more durable materials, so they're easier to see over time. And they tend to have different city layouts. They tend to be based around marketplaces, whereas you don't really see a marketplace at Cahokia. You don't really see a marketplace in Incan cities, for example. In fact, you don't see them at all, which really confused Western archaeologists, because they'd be like, but wait, is this the marketplace? But wait, where's the marketplace? And it's like, we don't do that, guys. We just don't have that thing, all right? It's just, you don't have to have a marketplace to have a city. So as for the question about sort of local traditions of archaeology, I mean, this is something that is a very big question in archaeology right now. And archaeologists, especially Western archaeologists who are working in other countries, particularly if it's countries in the developing world, have had to kind of, I mean, in the contemporary period, they're having to really, I think, come up with policies and regulations, which makes it sound a lot more codified than it really is. But all of the archaeological teams that I talked to that I thought were the most successful and that seemed to have learned the most were working very closely with local experts. So either they were working with, in the case of Angkor, working with archaeologists from Southeast Asia, or they were working with experts from Southeast Asia. So you don't have to be an archaeologist to be an expert in your own culture.
Right.
And that is also a kind of Western idea. And the other thing is that archaeology as a discipline is Western. So that's why we're kind of grappling with this history of kind of Western imperialism when we think about archaeology, because archaeology grows out of imperial incursions into other nations and other continents. And that's why you're always hearing stories like, oh, and then we discovered this indigenous city. And it's because, you know, for example, Cahokia was discovered by white settlers in the 17th century because they were settling, you know, they were coming to settle the land that belonged to indigenous people. And you see the same thing in Cambodia with Angkor. Angkor is allegedly discovered by a white dude, a French guy, in the 19th century because he's there as part of the imperial occupation of the area. So,
I thought
so there's a lot.
Like the other thing that blew my mind about Angkor was just the thinking of the layers. You talk about in the book about the king who was digging the gigantic reservoir and digging up another ancient city beneath it in order to then bury it in the reservoir.
That's right.
It just is like the most generative, like fantasy SF idea of like a city in a reservoir, and that the city that is growing next to it is literally drinking water.
Yeah, drinking water on top of this ancient Bronze Age settlement.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the thing. And I think, again, because we've gotten in the West, we've gotten so many of our stories about these places through Western archaeology, we have these sort of static images in our mind of like, there was a place called Angkor, and it was just this static thing where there was a king and a bunch of people doing stuff, and it rose up out of nowhere and then it disappeared. And of course, no, it rose up out of, thousands of years of history, of local history, of indigenous folks that lived there. And there are a lot of, at least in the case of Angkor, you mentioned the translation of the Khmer language, the ancient Khmer language. And that was actually done by a scholar in the 20th century, Saveros Poe, who unfortunately recently passed away. But she is this giant in the figure of Khmer studies, because before she did her work translating these ancient Khmer inscriptions in the temples, the only thing that archaeologists had been interested in, and these were by and large French archaeologists, they were only interested in the Sanskrit inscriptions, partly because they knew Sanskrit. They had already learned that from other imperial adventures. And partly because they just didn't think that the local language was important. They thought, well, Angkor and the Khmer Empire are really something that came out of South Asia. They're basically just a kind of subcategory of South Asian culture. And so who cares about their local language? Let's just focus on the Sanskrit. So it's imperialism wrapped in imperialism, because it's like the imperialists are like, oh, well, let's think about how the other imperial group affected this local group. So
turducken of just like
it's like
all the way down.
Yeah, I don't know. South Asians wrapped in French people. I don't know. So yeah. So basically Saveros Poe was like, hey, there's all these inscriptions that are incredibly important that no one has translated. And so with her knowledge of Khmer, of modern Khmer, she created the first dictionary of ancient Khmer, which allowed people to completely change their understanding of Khmer society, of the Khmer Empire, because the things that were written in Khmer were all the everyday life stuff. Sanskrit was reserved for like fancy stuff, like what the king was doing, or what pageants were happening. But people used Old Khmer to write about, to do their receipts, basically, like who sold what to whom, like who's working this week. There's all these lists of names of workers who built the city. And so it's a delight. And it's because of her that we have this incredible body of knowledge, because she was like, no, I'm not going to do what she was educated in France for her graduate studies. And she's like, no, I'm going to strike out on my own. I'm going to do this thing and uncover the real history of this place.
I'm thinking
not the real history, but the history that had not yet been uncovered.
Or the overwritten history, essentially.
The history that was ignored because it wasn't in the language of empire, basically.
I'm reminded here of you quoting Stephen Ellis in the Pompeii section, where saying that what we do is look for the usual. And I was so struck by that, like at Pompeii, archaeology tends to look for the big, the mighty, and the unusual, but what we do is look for the usual. And this is probably the section in the book where I wrote the most exclamation points in the margins, because I want to shift a little bit talking about methodologies, because they absolutely blew my mind here. I had, you know, my sense of what archaeology, what modern archaeology is like, is very cinematic, is very much like, you know, and I have seen exactly one Indiana Jones film, and it like, so it's not even that so much.
The important documentary, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not even that. It's more like an aesthetic of dusty places, little brushes, you know, hats, whatever. The fact that you were learning things with lasers, it just blew my mind. Was it lidar or lidar?
LiDAR, yeah.
LiDAR.
That's what they used at Angkor, yeah.
So Angkor, there's this like laser technology that I would love for you to talk about. But the thing that most like astonished me was the bit in Pompeii where talking about how they figured, I say you, obviously you're relating it, but like how they figured out that that people drove on the right side of the road.
I know. I love this story. So there's to kind of boil an incredibly large part of the book down into a few sentences. So a lot of modern archaeologists call themselves data archaeologists, partly because they use high-tech equipment to you know, get sort of 3D images of what they're looking at to save for later, but also because they're literally just gathering a bunch of data and putting it in spreadsheets. Like, it's nothing fancy. And so Eric Poehler, who is an archaeologist who works with Stephen Ellis, they are both really interested in that spreadsheet part of data archaeology. And so what Eric did was he went to Pompeii and he spent a lot of time lying down on the street looking at the marks left by carriages in the stones. And if you visit Pompeii, they're very obvious. This is not a subtle thing. Like, people drove through these streets and left basically tire marks, but from carriage wheels. And they, of course, are not perfect drivers. And so oftentimes when they're turning, they drive up on the curb. You know, so you're turning, you're getting your mule to go right, and you kind of, your wheel catches the curb. And he discovered, by studying curbstones and by looking at the wear patterns on them, that people drove on the right side of the street, because that's when they would knock into the curb when they were making a right-hand turn. If you're driving on the left-hand side, you would have a different wear pattern. And that's the kind of thing that I love. I love archaeology that uncovers everyday life and that tells us what ordinary people were doing, not what Emperor Titus was doing as he sacked Judea. I really wish he hadn't done that. And also, I don't care about that. Other people are writing about that. And so one of the big themes of this book is looking at the daily life of ordinary people. So the book focuses on laborers, it focuses on women and slaves. And that's partly thanks to the fact that so many archaeologists are now focusing on that. And they're working on gathering that data by looking at things like tire marks, or Stephen Ellis, who counts tabernas. Like, he went to Pompeii and figured out that there's like 161 tabernas for 12,000 people in the city. And we still haven't uncovered all of them. So I'm just saying that's a lot of pubs. You know, Pompeii was a party city. It was a vacation town. So it's that kind of work. And also the work that people like Saveros Po did, looking at all of those names written in Khmer, inscribed on the walls. Those were the names of laborers. Mm-hmm. And so that gives us this window. We're not just looking at, you know, what King Jayavarman VII did, but like what the people who built his reservoirs were doing.
I was really struck by like the casual cruelty of this phrase that some other archaeologist,
some crappy archaeologist,
whose name I refuse to commit to memory, who basically said something like these interminable lists of slaves or something like that.
That was an early 20th century French archaeologist who was a Sanskritist, and so he was interested in the Sanskrit stuff, and he referred to the Khmer stuff as interminable lists of names. And so in my book, I actually have a moment where I list a bunch of the names, because to me, like, there's so much power in that memory. It's like, it's the same idea of saying the name of someone who has been killed, or saying, you know, invoking their name is so important. And so I was like, yeah, I'm going to say their names. Like, those interminable lists of names were human beings. And like, we care about them. They're the ones that build the cities.
They're the ones that build the cities. This is the thing that I was really so deeply moved by as I was reading this, was I loved your focus so much on first of all, like on the way that you look at structures, like the way that in Pompeii, you notice the way that the villa is literally built on top of the shops of people who are working and stuff in a way that is a metaphor for everything else. And, but very much there's the fact that the mass is an anonymizing thing instead of a celebrating thing. Like the fact that there are so many people means that we have to care about them less as opposed to care about them more, because there were so many erecting these enormous things and having some piece of them. So I'm going to stop myself from asking like the 17,000 other questions. It is 15 minutes till the end, and we want to turn to audience questions, but thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you for your amazing questions. We could actually talk for like 5 hours. So like, you know.
I work that so much right now. Like there's just, so I'm going through these questions. Let's see. Fran Wild, hello friend, says, are cities, when they are lost in layers of time or consciously forgotten? And if both, why? I feel, did we kind of get to that? Actually, I'll let you just speak to that. I think we have.
I think it's a really good question, because there are different ways of losing cities. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the book, is that some cities are, so all the cities in this book were abandoned, which means people used their agency to leave, right? The city didn't just like vanish into thin air. People chose to leave them, including in the case of Pompeii. And Pompeii is kind of a special example because, of course, you can't really go back to a city that's been buried in toxic volcanic ash. But you can stay in the local area, which lots of people did. So when cities are lost, partly they're lost because they are so distant from us in time. And we can't, for example, like at Çatalhöyük, we don't really know what the people there believed. We don't know what they thought about the world. We can guess and we can try to reconstruct it, but we don't know. So that is part of the loss. But then the other part of this question, are cities consciously forgotten? That brings us back to some of the stuff we've been talking about with settler colonialism and then just like plain old invader colonialism. That's what's so interesting about the city of Cahokia, which is a city that has been deliberately erased over and over again. It's a city that when Europeans stumbled across it hundreds of years ago, they knew immediately that it had been a city, that it had been massive, and that it had taken an incredible amount of sophisticated labor to build it. It's a city with enormous earthen mounds at its core. It was a city that stretched for kilometers and kilometers. And those earthen mounds appear throughout the city. So when Europeans arrived, they saw this landscape that was super obviously, basically terraformed. And there's no mistaking it for anything natural. And they just sort of dismissed it as like, well, it couldn't have been indigenous people that did this. You know, there was a theory for a while that ancient Egyptians had come over and built it, because how could these Indians have built it? And so because of the fact that Europeans wanted to kind of perpetuate a myth that the tribes that they were meeting and the nations that they were meeting were primitive or were not capable of building their own urban civilizations, people deliberately did not talk about the idea of Cahokia being a city. It was turned into farms. Farmers plowed it under and ruined a lot of the artifacts. In the 19th century, one of the biggest mounds in the city in St. Louis was torn down to be landfill under a railroad. And one of my favorite examples of how this kind of deliberate forgetting works is that right on the site of downtown Cahokia, in the 1940s, people built a drive-in called Mounds Drive-In. So it was named after the most obvious architectural monuments of the city, one of which was like literally feet away from the Mounds Drive-In. So there's this kind of remembering and forgetting that take place when you do things like that, where, you know, the descendants of European settlers were kind of memorializing the city, but kind of erasing the city with that drive-in.
I think so much of settler colonial ideology, whether it's explicit or implicit, relies on positioning indigeneity as primitive, right? And positioning and having an understanding of primitive that is rooted in really specific ideas about material conditions. So like, one of the things in this book that is so valuable to me as a casual reader, I think, is getting some of this language to be able to say that there's a lot of ideology built into what counts as a city. And for,
yes, oh my
right?
God.
And so like even correcting for that, like, so if all you say, if like for something to be a city, it needs to have a banking system and stone structures and religion or whatever other set of random things, then obviously you're going to silo off all of these other thriving, complex, absolutely fascinating places that should be what we think of as cities by any other meaningful standard and stuff. But obviously, if you counter that, then it's going to threaten your project of civilizing, as it were.
Yeah. And there's also, I would say, the other piece of this to remember is that some of these quote unquote lost cities are also remembered in ways that are very political. For example, when the Khmer Rouge were kind of driven into the north of Cambodia, their last kind of bunker was in an ancient Angkorian temple, where they used part of the temple as a weapons cache and had a camp there. And that was because they saw themselves as being connected to this great imperial history of the Khmer Empire. And actually now their weapons bunker, it's kind of shaped like a stupa. It's round. It's been turned into a stupa. So if you go to this temple, Priya Vihaar, you'll see that people have like covered it in flowers and ribbons and incense. And so it's been reclaimed and reclaimed and reclaimed. And it's a really interesting process of cultural memory.
I'm going to jump to another question quickly. Speaking of Cahokia, were you able to talk with indigenous people in the Midwest about it? Is there any like current cultural memory there?
Yeah, I mean, there are tribes that, like the Osage, have, you know, claimed and are actually protectors of some of the mounds. One of the things that's interesting about Cahokia is that indigenous folks from a lot of different areas claim it as part of kind of a greater historical backdrop, in the same way that Europeans will say, well, we come from a Roman civilization, even though we're not necessarily, there's no direct line between like white people now and Romans. And so I talked to indigenous folks from a bunch of different tribes who had connections to Cahokia. It was really interesting. I have a section in the book where I talked to Rebecca Roanhorse, who's a fiction writer who we both know, who has a new novel out called Black Sun that's part of a trilogy where she's kind of reimagining in a fantasy world what Cahokia's meaning was. And I see there's a lot of that in contemporary indigenous writing and art, kind of reimagining the mounds and thinking through what they mean. There are linguistic links and cultural links between many different Siouan tribes and nations and Cahokia, but again, there's no one group that says like this is definitely ours. It's really something that belongs to many, many people. And as I said, it was abandoned in the 14th century, so long before white settlers came. So it really is history within history. Yeah, it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I really encourage people to go and learn about North American history.
Awesome. I'm scanning through the questions a little bit. There's I think a few questions are kind of clustering around this idea, which I find fascinating and I wanted to ask you myself. is there an element of what about our cities today do you think archaeologists will puzzle over in the future? Is there anything that is in our, I mean, I found myself thinking about everything from the internet to just the absolute ubiquity of people documenting their own lives in a way that you are often pointing to the absence of in this book. So I'm wondering, do you ever think about that? Do you ever think about our lives as historical artifacts for the future?
I definitely do all the time. And there's a couple things I'll say about that. One is that, of course, there's the overall plastic layer that we are creating, which is what a lot of people call the Anthropocene layer. So we are creating a layer in the geological record that will be very recognizable. That is our current moment where we're using and disposing of a lot of plastic, and that is not going to biodegrade anytime soon. And then there's the other stuff where you realize when you're looking into archaeology that a lot of stuff that gets preserved is random. Archaeologists spend a lot of time digging up trash. That's how we learn about ancient people, is from trash heaps. I spent a lot of time at Cahokia looking at trash heaps. And so things you throw away might end up actually being preserved. There's a famous sci-fi novel from the 20th century called The Canticle for Leibowitz, which is all about how like some dude's grocery list gets preserved and that becomes kind of the center of this weird cult. And that's actually not, that's actually a good observation about how archaeology works. And, as to people preserving their lives through the internet and through all of our relentless self-documentation, a lot of that stuff is going to disappear. Like one of the things I think people who are in tech will say to me all the time, like, oh, well, we'll never have this problem again because we can put all the world's knowledge into like a server. And I'm like, yeah, who's going to preserve the server? Like as soon as you have a regime that hates your knowledge, they're just going to kill that server and it's gone. And no, but there'll be redundant servers. And it's like, maybe we'll lose like half of the internet and we'll only have this one half and it'll be like Parler and we won't have, and people will be like, oh, wow. So this was the politics of the 21st century. It's very interesting. Oh, so, like that's the thing, right? Is you can't necessarily control it. And that was what was so funny about talking to some of the archaeologists about Emperor Nero, who actually was really great on women's rights, and he helped
I learned that from this book.
and one of the archaeologists I talked to, she was like, she's a classicist. She was like, yeah, the only records we have about Nero were written by these arch conservatives who hated him because he was so interested in theater and they thought he was kind of gay and like they just hated all these things. And so it would be kind of like if the only records that were preserved of the Obama administration in the United States were written by like Ben Shapiro. And so everybody's like the great library of Ben Shapiro, and like, which wouldn't be completely an inaccurate chronicle of the time, but of course it would be just this one very narrow perspective on what
version for sure. Oh
yeah. And that is all the time happening in archaeology, where it's just like, well, we have like this one guy who's telling us about what happened, and he might have a very strong political position.
Oh
we just,
gosh.
And we don't know what the pro-Nero people thought.
Oh my gosh, I'm reminded, I'm trying to say this as I'm scanning for the questions, of mudlarking, actually. Lara Micklem has a wonderful Instagram and book called Mudlarking, just about like finding things in the Thames in London, and just going onto the foreshore and finding clay pipes, Roman pottery, needles, all of these things. Like I feel like so much material culture that was thrown away, that was trash, that was detritus. Okay, an aspirational question to end on. What are you hoping that readers carry from your book that influences how to view our society or community challenges of today?
That is, let me try to, in the minute we have remaining, let me try to sum that up. I think two things. One is that if you're worried about your city being abandoned, one thing to know is that unless a massive volcano buries it in ash, cities are abandoned very slowly. It's very unlikely that a city will be abandoned overnight. It usually takes about a century for a city to be completely abandoned. So you might not even know if your city is being abandoned or is about to be abandoned. And oftentimes cities are partially abandoned and then undergo a revitalization. This happened at Cahokia. And the city kind of bounces back and looks very different and has a very different social structure. So again, if you feel like your city is being abandoned, don't give up hope, because cities can be remade. Cities are people, and people, when they put their minds to it, can really rebuild quickly. And the other part is that even when cities are abandoned, and this is the memory piece that we were talking about earlier, the importance of memory, even when a city like, say, Cahokia is abandoned, or Angkor, those cities are still very important. That tells us what our ancestors were doing. Knowing what our ancestors were doing, knowing the mistakes they made, knowing their triumphs, helps us to chart a course into the future. And that's really what I get out of looking at these cities, is understanding how a big group of people came together and somehow, against all odds, built something beautiful and incredible, and had amazing parties and wonderful art, and beautiful public spaces. And yeah, they abandoned it, but they did leave behind a record of what they did. And especially now, as climate change is really altering how we're going to have to build cities and how we're going to live in them, it's really important to look back at this history and think about what it was that people were doing back then, and how they dealt with a lot of the same problems that we're having now. They had problems with unstable governments. They had problems with the climate, and they made it through. They survived. And when it got too crappy, they picked up at great hardship and moved somewhere else. They became immigrants, went to new cities and new places, and kept those memories of the older cities with them. So cities don't get lost. They just transform.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. So thank you, Annalee. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation, and just for further illuminating your extremely beautiful book that I cannot enough recommend to everyone. I'm just going to hold it up because it is so very beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm going to hold up Amal's book, which you should all get.
That's too kind. Thank you so much.
Yes. This is a time travel book. So if you're interested in history, time travel's the next step.
The absolute last thing I want to say about this is just that thinking of time travel, one of the things I loved about this book was the way that you documented the jet lag that you were feeling when you got to certain places, because it really drove home to me the futurity required to travel into the past. The fact that we can do this, that we can go from ancient city to ancient city, on continent to continent, felt like this really science fictional thing to be able to experience, that we need this much future so that we can go that far into the past. And I just loved how you embodied that in this book. So yeah.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for coming. And please do support the library, not just by buying our books, but by buying all the books that you can in the library bookstore. New York Public Library is incredible. It's a wonderful resource, and it's a public resource. Mm-hmm. So this is like one of the beautiful things about cities, is that it creates public spaces where you can just learn stuff just because you're part of the public. So
exactly. Hardcore.
All right.
Love the New York Public Library. Thank you all, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much for wonderful tech people for making this happen.
Yes.
And have a lovely rest of the night, and have a great conclusion to tour, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll dream of cities tonight.
Thank you for joining us tonight. On screen, we are playing a closing slide with the New York Public Library lion logo. Learn more about the New York Public Library, nypl.org.